to the Captain Spot. I'm your host, Justin Freeman, 6 foot 1 inches, 276 pounds of fantasy knowledge. And today, we've got enough of this evergreen stuff. We are jumping into the slates. It's the Thursday night game. It's Chiefs Texans. It's the season opener. So I brought in one of the heaviest hitters in Showdown DFS, one and only Mr. Colin Drew from DailyRoto. You guys will recognize Colin's name from the top of the leaderboards, that's for sure, on these Showdown slates. So Colin brings a wealth of knowledge. We're going to break down Chiefs Texans, but before we do, a reminder to go over to CaptainSpot.com. That's CPTSpot.com, where you can access everything we have to offer. We've got some great promo codes out there right now, and of course we're selling the Captain Spot ebook. You've got to get a copy of that. It's still half price. I'm trying to give you guys as much time as possible to buy it. I know you want to buy it, so please go over to CaptainSpot.com and check it out. $34.99. You can't beat it. It's got everything you would ever hope to know about playing Showdown DFS. But without further ado, that's enough sales pitch. Let's hop into our interview with Colin. All right, everybody, as promised, we are joined by the one and only Mr. Colin Drew from DailyRoto. You guys will recognize him from the top of your leaderboards on these Showdown streets. So without any further ado, Colin, welcome. How are you doing today, bud?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. You've had a great lineup of guests. I hope I can kind of hold up to all the good information they put out there. If you guys are looking to do well at Showdown this year, I think you've come to the right spot. This has definitely been a great kind of lead into the season, and hopefully we can get some slate-specific stuff moving forward too.
Yeah, I think so. What's funny is everybody who comes on this show is like, man, you've got to get Colin Drew on. You got to get Colin Drew on. So I'm like, okay. Just wait. We'll get Drewby on. And no better time for us to get together than to talk a little bit of Chiefs, Texans. We'll talk about this week one slate. And a little bit more specifically, we'll talk about process. Like I just did a show that released earlier this week that talked about the process and sort of some of the things that we are considering when building out projections and building out anticipated game flows and things of that nature. But today we're going to talk a little bit about a specific game. We're going to talk about Chiefs Texans. We're going to break that down, and then sort of the rules and flows we want to do when we're building out mass multi-entry type lineups using optimizer technology. So we'll go over a little bit of that stuff. So without any further ado, Colin, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit about your background and how you got here? Obviously, you are a renowned player on the Showdown format, and I know you play NFL, and I believe you're playing a couple other sports right now too.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I've been kind of in the industry for, I guess, like 5 or 6 years now, but moved into it full time a couple of years ago, working with Drew and Mike over at DailyRoto. They kind of brought me in. My role was mostly on the business side, but then obviously, like anybody in the industry, we're super passionate about it and can't help but dive into the content side of things. So, ironically, Showdown was actually a format I didn't have a lot of respect for when it came out. And I had like sent some snarky email to DraftKings when they sent me a Showdown offer, just like kind of dismissing the single game format. And then a year later, it was like the best format in the world. It was my most profitable thing by far. And now I think I've won like 15 5-figure prizes, 3 6-figure prizes. And there's definitely a lot of room. You've had some really good guests in here. They all have their own process. And I definitely think everyone needs to figure out what works for them. And, what I've done is try to figure out something that I think I can replicate on a week-to-week basis that will kind of keep me live, but, not necessarily chasing the solo win. I would say my process focuses more on correlation and kind of increasing that in my lineups than it does trying to find like the unique solo $1 million score.
Gotcha. And that makes a lot of sense. So I assume that in some of your large field GPP wins, you're probably chopping with a handful of people if you're not focused strictly on making unique lineups.
Yeah, definitely. And I think all of them have been chopped with at least one person. And then there have been a bunch of them that have been chopped with maybe like 10 to 20 people. And I think that's sort of the sweet spot for me is you want to be excited when you win. So if you're chopping with like 300 people for $800 in profit, like you're not going to be super excited about that. But if you're chopping $1 million, like 20 ways, like that's still going to get my heart racing a little bit. And that's kind of the sweet spot that I'm looking for season in order to capture one unique win and having that pay off. That may be a more profitable approach, but I think for me, I think trying to get in contention a little bit more consistently and being live on more slates is just something that I think is a better combination of, volatility while still being a profitable strategy. So that's kind of where I focus is on the correlations with kind of reducing the duplicates so that when you do chop it, it's still an exciting prize, but not necessarily the solo win.
Yeah, well, whatever you're doing seems to be working pretty well. So I guess my next question is, how much of your work is done sort of before you ever even get to the optimizer? In other words, do you have a lot of homework to do before you're ever ready to start clicking things around? Obviously, the slate comes out. We've got prices for every player. You can probably get your hands on some projections relatively quickly. But is there anything else that we're focusing on before we hop straight into optimizers to build out your 150 max run?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing beyond the optimizer and the projections is trying to understand the interactions between players on a specific team. And some specific examples, week 1, there's a lot of unknowns as far as like the personnel and usage. But as you get to like week 10 or 11, you start to know more about these teams. And so I think one example with the Texans is we've got a lot of new wide receivers on the team. We expect Randall Cobb to play the slot. Brandon Cooks is on the injury report, but he would play an outside wide receiver position. And then Kenny Stills can play kind of in the slot or the outside wide receiver. And so you're looking there at 3 wide receivers who are competing a little bit with each other for snaps. And so being able to understand that and how it may impact groups or rules that you want to build is kind of one of the other areas I go. But for the most part, it's it's the projections within the optimizer, focusing on like 75th percentile projections versus median projections, and then kind of understanding the player interactions with each other, mostly as it relates to playing time.
Yeah, and I think that's what you just hit on there is really critical and something to drill down into, the 75th percentile. Like, we have a tendency to want to think about these really exaggerated game scripts. What if the Chiefs just beat the Texans by 30 points and it's just all running game in the entire second half? And a lot of times, like, that gets us thinking things a little bit too simplistic. Like, most NFL games are relatively close. Like, there's not going to be a ton of rushing attempts to salt the game away, for example, until maybe the last drive of the fourth quarter. So I think thinking in terms of 75th percentile as opposed to, say, 95th percentile is a really helpful way to consider how you're building some of these lineups. Like, you don't need every player in your lineup to have an absolutely, stud fest. Like, it doesn't have to be a crazy outlier type event. It can just be a combination of guys who all marginally exceed expectation, and that's what wins the lineup. It's going 6 for 6 on that and having the right one of those in the captain spot. So I think that's a really good takeaway for sure. And as we get into Houston, Kansas City here, we're talking about a game with a 54.5 point total. So, I mean, this is one that if it was on the main slate, it would certainly be drawing a lot of attention. There'd be a lot of ownership around both Chiefs and Texans players. And the Texans are currently dogs by about 9 to 9.5 points, depending on where you're finding your line. So overall, when I tell you that, there's going to be a total that high and a spread that large, are there any sort of natural things that come to your mind as like how I want to attack this type of slate?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this team in general, that all the skill position players are going to flood into the optimals anyways. And I think that naturally is going to lead to less emphasis on the defensive special teams position than you might have in a normal slate. And I'm kind of on board with that approach. Typically when I see a game like this, one of the things I like to do is try to just run the vanilla optimizer first and see what it spits out. And I think what you'll see is a ton of 5-1 Chiefs onslaughts as far as the overall roster construction. And I think in general, that's something that is an underutilized strategy in these showdown formats is the 5-1 onslaught. Perhaps this week it'll be a little bit more popular. And sometimes when that's the case, I like to run 2 sets of 75 lineups instead of 1 set of 150. So I might run 1 set of lineups that is basically how Vegas projects it with, the Chiefs winning a game by 10 or so points. That means the Texans are probably going to be a little bit more pass heavy towards the back of the game. You kind of want those guys as the one-off plays in your lineup, like the Will Fuller type plays. But I may run another set of lineups that is focused more on if the Texans are actually able to do a little bit better job defensively against Kansas City and are able to keep the game more competitive. And so what that would do is start to shift some of those lineups away from where everybody's projecting them and to a scenario where it's not like a wildly outlandish thing for the Texans to keep it close or even win by a point, but it is like a standard deviation away from what's expected. And I think sometimes that's where the best lineups come out, is not something that's totally off the radar, not this game turning into a 30-point slop fest, but something that is a little different than Vegas expects, but basically one standard deviation in one direction or the other.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like a healthy way to approach it without taking on too much risk, because this is an inherently volatile game that we're playing. So, keeping it within expectations, gives us a chance to be different, but also embrace some uniqueness there on the periphery. So when we're looking at this particular slate, Colin, I guess let's hop right into some of the players and the way we think this game is going to pan out. Have you started making lineups already? And are you attracted to different guys in different parts of your order? Are there any sort of general rules and groups that we want to make sure we're emphasizing as we're, working with optimizers?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and hopefully we get some clarity on some of the roles leading into week one, but there are a lot of question marks, maybe more so than a normal slate, and trying to understand how like the field is going to see those, I think is going to be an important one. Talked a little bit about Brandon Cooks and just appearing on the injury report. He's been limited a little bit as far as his snap reps in the preseason and training camp from what we've read, and so it's possible that like Kenny Stills could see an outsized portion of the role compared to what we might be thinking as far as like best ball drafts and things like that for week one. And then on the Chiefs side of things, I think there's also plenty of questions. I know Mecole Hardman is a really popular player in these best ball drafts, really high upside guy that connected on some big plays last year, but is he going to jump into a huge role week one, or will Sammy Watkins still continue to play ahead of him? And then you also have the Chiefs running back situation with Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Darrell Williams kind of splitting snaps there. Clyde Edwards-Helaire should see the vast majority of the ownership as well, but Darrell Williams is a particularly good value. And so as part of 5-1 onslaughts, I think that he's a pretty important player to consider for the flex position. And so right now I'm kind of in the process of trying to figure out as much news as I can on those specific roles. And then I can kind of be able to create some groups around those. And I think, one of the groups I'll probably create for the Texans is to play at most two of Kenny Stills, Brandon Cooks, and Randall Cobb in a given lineup, just because I think that they're going to be competing so much for snaps. It's unlikely that all three of those players see a big role, but it's pretty possible that two of them do.
So you hit on that running back committee possibility in Kansas City between Darrell Williams and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Do you have a lean as to sort of how you anticipate that workload to be split up? Because, obviously all the draft equity is rolled up in Clyde Edwards-Helaire. However, all the good news this offseason has been surrounding Darrell Williams, and it sounds like he is going to have a role. How do we balance those two things, especially in week one when there's so much uncertainty? Is it just have exposure to both these guys across the portfolio? Do you want to think about putting both of them in the same lineup?
Yeah, I'm usually a guy who doesn't X out players like arbitrarily. So I'm not usually taking big stands on players there. I kind of let the shuffle and volatility settings handle my player exposures for me. I think what I am thinking about is how they interact with each other. And right now I think we've got Edwards-Helaire projected for around 60% of the carries and 10% of the targets. And he's definitely a higher upside player than Darrell Williams. But I think that you can still see scenarios where they both end up in the winning lineups, particularly if what is expected to happen happens and the Chiefs kind of roll the Texans. Maybe they even win by 17 instead of 10. And you could see both those guys. But I think one of the harder things is if Edwards-Helaire is the captain. I think that means he's probably taken on, the majority of the touchdown equity, maybe a higher than anticipated share of the carries. And so what I would probably do here is create a negative key boost rule for the two players when Edwards-Helaire is the captain, so that in the optimizer, you can essentially tell it, if Edwards-Helaire is the captain, then for those lineups, I want you to decrease the projection of Darrell Williams by 20%.
That makes a lot of sense. And does that, by putting Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the captain, does that impact how you feel about the pass catchers from Kansas City as well? Does that say something about, or even Patrick Mahomes for that matter? Obviously Mahomes is the most expensive player on the slate. So does that make a difference in how much you want Mahomes if you've got Edwards-Helaire in the captain, or how much you want exposure to Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, those premier playmakers? Because it's going to get really expensive to try to jam in all those guys.
Yeah, I think that is definitely something to try to think about. Specifically with Edwards-Helaire, I think that we do expect some of his value to come from receiving work. And so Mahomes is a guy that was able to connect with like Damian Williams last year. And so I'm not as worried about playing Mahomes in those lineups. I will think about that stuff with a running back that might be more rush heavy. Like if we're talking like Sony Michel on, last year's version of the Patriots, or even this year's version, I would think about that a little bit more. And then as far as the correlation between the running backs and the wide receivers, that's not something I bake in. Typically, if I'm using a running back at the captain spot, I think about how they might correlate with other running backs on that team. And then I think about how they correlate with the opposing team, defensive, special teams, kicker. And I try to create negative boosts for those opposed to the skill positions on their own team. And I think that's especially true in a game where we expect the Chiefs, 5-1 onslaughts to be a pretty viable strategy.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, the backfield on the other side of the field, the Houston Texans backfield, is another really interesting one to try to figure out. Obviously, the team brought in David Johnson this offseason. He looks like he's going to be a workhorse running back, working ahead of Duke Johnson, the other D Johnson for the Texans. So as you're clicking on DraftKings, make sure that you know which one you are clicking into between David and Duke Johnson. Don't make that mistake because they do get abbreviated there. But David Johnson is a guy who really popped when I ran out some simulations earlier this week because he's getting, I have him projected for a pretty heavy role in the run game and a above average role in the passing game. Like he's a guy that we have seen take on targets. The only question is, does he sacrifice some of those? Like we've seen him be a target hog in the past in Arizona. We know he has those passing game chops, but that's basically Duke Johnson's bread and butter. So to what extent can we project passing game role for David Johnson? And does he make sense in a lineup where the Texans are projected to lose by right at double digits?
Yeah. I think he's viable in there, but I think right now we've got them, between David Johnson and Duke Johnson, we've got them projected for just under 20% of the targets. So it's a pretty healthy number going to the running backs. And I think in this specific scenario, we've kind of got it split still in David Johnson's favor, but still having Duke involved a little bit. And at 7,600, I think that probably ends up a position I'm a little bit underweight on. But one of the optimizer settings I like to do to deal with situations like this, where there is more uncertainty than normal, is to dial up the volatility setting. And so that essentially lets you run a projection within a percent plus or minus for a given player. So you can set it at 20%, and instead of running just the straight projection, it'll run each with a random projection plus or minus 20% of that. And so when you have these situations where the guy's upside is actually pretty high, but so is like his downside, then I'll try to use the volatility setting to manage kind of that, opposed to something that is a little bit more consistent. Like there's no question as far as what Travis Kelce's role is, or Tyreek Hill, or even Will Fuller in week one. There's kind of not any questions about those. So to me, those are like lower volatility plays. And then some of the guys that might be lower projected, but it's due to uncertainty, I try to use the volatility to account for that.
Well, let me ask you about Will Fuller, because I do have questions about what his role is, especially if Brandon Cooks plays, because I've seen, I believe ESPN's Mike Clay actually has Brandon Cooks projected to outscore Will Fuller this year. So there are reasonable minds that differ on maybe who is actually the number one wide receiver in this particular offense. Is there an argument that Brandon Cooks actually could be the target leader between he and Will Fuller?
It seems like if you wanted to make the argument over the course of the season and you wanted to take into account Will Fuller's injury history and bake that into the projections, then maybe that's where I would see it as like a valid argument. Specifically, as far as week one, it seems really unlikely that that's going to be the case. Now, that doesn't mean that Cooks can't possibly be the winning captain on a lineup, but he has been limited as far as his reps in training camp. So he's a wide receiver on a new team that hasn't played as many reps with the starting quarterback. And then specifically popping up on the injury report, and then also just knowing that the kind of the odds that he has to split some snaps with Kenny Stills at the outside wide receiver position, I think just kind of decrease, that likelihood, especially early in the season. So if Cooks was to emerge as the number one target, to me, that seems like it's something that's much more likely to happen as the season goes on, opposed to what we have here in week one.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Where Cooks would project out a lot better over the course of 16 games than possibly Will Fuller. I mean, they could be right there neck and neck. I could at least see that better than in the specific game. Now, if we're moving on to the receiving options in Kansas City, obviously we know Tyreek Hill locked in number one ace receiver, but it does get a little bit confusing as to what to do from there. It seems like the team really wants to emphasize Sammy Watkins as their number two again, and then presumably Mecole Hardman right behind him, and then Demarcus Robinson. Are you interested in going as deep as number four receivers on teams in general when we're playing these showdown slates? Or is that typically getting a little too thin? I mean, we know that Kansas City has a pretty narrow target tree. Like it's, the balls go to Tyreek Hill and the balls go to Travis Kelce, and we can probably project, secondary roles for Edwards-Helaire and Sammy Watkins in this example. But, how far down that depth chart do you feel comfortable going, and how do you feel about the wide receivers in Kansas City in general?
So I think a mistake a lot of people make is they don't go far enough down the depth chart. And a lot of times that's where the winning plays end up happening, whether it's, something that wasn't anticipated as far as the role, or something that's just a big play. that kind of gets there all at once. And Mecole Hardman is definitely the type of guy who can get there with, one single play. And it's possible that he does step into a bigger role in his second year. As far as the captain specific position, I'm usually cutting that off at like the wide receiver 3 on a specific team. So, I'm not getting as deep at the captain. I think I want the guy to be involved in the offense consistently. I really want the guy to be able to put up like 20 plus DraftKings points some reasonable percent of the time. And so I'll probably cut off the player pool at the captain position a little bit more aggressively than I do at flex. For flex, like absolutely, I think that Demarcus Robinson is still in play, especially when you think about like things that might happen to reduce the ownership or reduce the number of duplicates that you're having. Finding like 1 or 2 players that are sub 10% that have the ability to put up even like 6 to 10 DraftKings points can go a long way to reducing the number of duplicates. So if I was building a single entry, Robinson's definitely not in consideration for me here, even in 3 max, not a guy that I'd look to target. But as you think about 150 max MME, I definitely think that you should be using guys like this on a consistent basis, probably even getting over the field percentage most of the time.
Who's the wide receiver 2 in Kansas City, Sammy or Mecole Hardman?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kansas City I will think about as like, Kelsey and Tyreek Hill are wide receivers 1 and 2. But
yeah.
The Watkins versus Hardman debate is a pretty tough one. I think I talked about this a lot with Davis Maddock, and I know he's a Kansas City fan. He obviously loves the upside of Mecole Hardman, and I think you could see some really exciting things if he were to step into a bigger role. But it does seem like Watkins is going to be on the field more consistently. In another example where I think you can use the volatility setting to your benefit here is if we have Sammy Watkins projected for a higher market share of targets, which is something we do have projected right now, then I think you can kind of run Watkins in his like 15% target share at a lower volatility. And you could run, Hardman in like a 10 or 12% target share at a higher volatility. And that will kind of reflect some of the uncertainty as well as some of the big play potential of Mecole Hardman.
For the Texans tight ends, if there were ever just one of them, we could probably play them quite frequently in DFS formats or season-long formats for that matter. But there's always 2. There's always been 2 as long as Deshaun Watson's been around. And this year it looks like it's Jordan Akins and Darren Fells this year. Do you have a read on how the targets are split up between those 2 guys? And are any of them worth playing at price?
So I don't have a clear read on that. It does seem like something where they'll both be involved a little bit. Those are the type of players I definitely exclude from captain. I still kind of run in the flex position. And right now on DraftKings, it's something where I'm not getting a lot of exposure to either one of them. And I'm not getting a lot of exposure to Kale Waring as well, who might be a guy who is not involved a ton, but is active for the game. And if they're active, you at least want to include them in projections. He's $600. So he does a lot as far as letting you fit in expensive players, carrying no ownership himself, letting you reduce duplicates. So I know you talked a little bit about FanDuel strategy with some of the guests that you had, but one random touchdown in the FanDuel format from somebody like him can actually do a lot as far as creating a unique lineup. So I think he's kind of viable in 150 max as a guy that maybe hits like 2 to 3% of your lineups, in the field owns at like 0.5%. But obviously is not a guy that's like a core play, and it's you're very likely to take a 0 there.
And just correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing you say quite frequently that you are doing correlation boosts between one player and another. So in other words, if, like you mentioned, if Clyde Edwards-Helaire is in the captain, I want to do a decrease boost or whatever the opposite of boost is down to Darrell Williams. And I think you could use that same logic, obviously, across many positions and the way 2 people can impact one another. So what other people do you see that when I put Tyreek Hill in the captain spot, I want to reduce the expectation of points for, what other players, and then generally speaking, it sounds like that's not really a rule. Like we're not saying if Clyde Edwards-Helaire is in the captain, we never want Darrell Williams. That's not exactly what we're saying, but what we're saying is please be sure to decrease what we are expecting from him as a general baseline in that particular occurrence, which allows him to get in, but doesn't necessarily give him the best chance to get in. And that keeps us from making things too binary. So what other players do you look at and see, like, if they're in the captain, I want to reduce somebody else specifically?
Yeah. So first on the key boost. So what happens structurally when that, a little nerding out on the math side, but you're essentially creating 2 forks of the optimizer with different sets of projections. And so if a normal slate is searching through tens of thousands of showdown permutations to figure out what the optimal lineup is, as you increase the number of branches, you're exponentially increasing the number of like the math that it has to go through to figure that out. So because of that, we've actually limited the optimizer to, I think, like 10 or 12 key boost rules that you can do. So I try to use them selectively. They're kind of like a surgical thing opposed to the hammer. With like the Texans tight ends, I'm fine using the hammer probably and saying, give me at most one of these Texans tight ends in a lineup. And then, like you said, I'm trying to use the surgical key boost tool for the positions that have more correlations within each other. So for running backs specifically, I think that's usually the position at the captain spot that I like to use the key boost rule for the most. And then I also like to use it for interactions between defensive special teams, whether or not they're captain or flex, and then kickers themselves. Some of those you could potentially just group out and say I want at most one kicker, at most one defense special teams. But what I like to use it is, for example, I think that the Texans D is obviously negatively correlated with Mahomes, but given the pricing dynamics on the slate, it's possible that they generate enough sacks or turnovers and no other punts come through that they end up on the optimal lineup. So I would usually use a key boost rule to try to, help with that interaction opposed to grouping it out entirely.
Yeah, because I mean, something as dramatic as a pick six from Patrick Mahomes on the first drive of the game, theoretically hurts Mahomes, right? Like he gets the -1 point for the interception. But the defense just got 8 points for the pick six, the touchdown and the interception. And now we have put Patrick Mahomes in a great game script. So there are ways to imagine, the defense and the opposing quarterback both succeeding at the same time. This is Showdown. We don't get a large sample. We get one occurrence. And so embracing some of that volatility, I think, is kind of a healthy way to approach it. Now, you've been doing this Showdown stuff longer than I have. And, nobody lets you leave until you pick who is going to be the captain on this particular slate. And that kind of bugs me because, well, it depends, right? There's a lot of different ways the slate can unfold. So how do you answer that question in general when somebody says, well, who do I play? Who is the captain? Who should I prioritize in the flex? How do you go about answering that question week in, week out, slate in, slate out?
Yeah, I think like the cop-out answer is it's a personal decision, and it kind of like it accounts for risk management and how much of a, are you willing to do things consistently? I think the right way to do things, even if you're building just one lineup, is to think about it over the set of like the first month of the season. You're going to get 12 contests there. You want to do things consistently across those 12 contests and put yourself in a position to be in contention in one of those. And I think one of the areas that is a good way to do that is by focusing on wide receivers and running backs at the flex position. So I think on the Texans side, Will Fuller is a guy that I think is a very viable captain. He will be a popular captain, but probably less so than like Mahomes, probably less so than like Watson, and maybe even less so than the like Kelsey and Tyreek Hill. And so I think he would be a guy that has obviously a ton of upside, could easily finish the number one scoring play on the slate, regardless of game script. And then it's also the type of thing where you don't always have to be the best play as long as you're the best play relative to your salary. So I do think that he's one of the strongest captain plays. And in general, I think that the strongest captain plays is to get overweight the field on these wide receiver tight end plays.
Gotcha. And why don't you, before we head on out of here, give me your favorite cheap play on this slate. It could be a defense, a kicker, or any of these garbage tight ends or fourth string wide receivers that you like. Give me a sub 5K play that you think is going to be in the winning lineup.
Yeah, it's $1,800. Darrell Williams, I think, is our favorite punt play of the night. We've got him only projected for 20% of the carries and 5% of the targets for the Chiefs. So we've got him projected for a pretty low roll relative to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's still popping into my optimal lineups more than 40% of the time. And part of that is just that the 5-1 Chiefs onslaught is something that's very viable on this slate. At $1,800 Darrell Williams also lets you leave a lot of salary on the table, increasing your odds of generating a unique lineup. And he doesn't have to do a lot to pay off that price tag. He just has to outscore the other punts. So if Darrell Williams gets a cheap touchdown or even just 6 to 8 DraftKings points, I think we'll be putting ourselves in a pretty good position relative to the rest of the field.
You heard it there. We can't let a Showdown slate go by without using the phrase skeleton key. Darrell Williams is your skeleton key to making all the other pieces fit in the lineup. So, Drewby, thank you so much for joining us to break down this slate. Before you head out of here, tell everybody what you're working on, where they can find you this season.
Yeah, all our stuff is over at DailyRoto. We've got the optimizer up there, which will incorporate ownership projections this year as well, which is new for this year for the Showdown formats. I'll be doing a podcast with Brian Jester from Occupy Fantasy, who you guys heard earlier on the captain spot, one of the really sharpest guys that I know for Showdown. We approach things completely different, which is why I think the podcast will be pretty interesting for DailyRoto subscribers and Occupy Fantasy subscribers. And, I'll be breaking down the Monday night and Thursday night slates with Brian, and then we'll also have write-ups for both those slates and the Sunday night football kind of primetime slates as well.
Sounds like a plan, man. Well, you've got everything you need to know, guys, here for Chiefs Texans Thursday night football. Be sure you're tuning in. Make sure you're getting some good lineups out there. I hope everybody runs hot this weekend. And thanks again, Colin, for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Really appreciate Colin Drew from DailyRoto joining us on today's show to talk Chiefs Texans. That was excellent. I hope you guys have walked away with a pretty good understanding of how to work through these optimizers. And we used, obviously, this slate today to break down what all you can do, what rules you can make, what adjustments you can make. And so be sure that you're considering all those things as you're working on building a mass entry run. But for the single entry folks out there, you got the takes. You know who to play. We know what we're expecting in this game. We know how to get different. If that's what you're trying to do, we know how to get unique. You've got all the tools in the tool belt, guys. The only thing left to do is go out there and take down this $1 million top prize. Available, on both sites, DraftKings and FanDuel. It's going to be great for a Thursday night opener. You got to love it. It's Chiefs Texans. You couldn't ask for anything better. So once again, head on over to cptspot.com where you can check out everything we have to offer. Go buy the ebook. You want to. You got just a few hours left to read it here before the season starts, but it'll be a great resource for you all season long. Thanks again to Colin, and we'll check you guys out very soon here for the Sunday Night Football Show. See ya.